how do we, in as smooth and quick as a process as possible, figure out how we can get along without them? Because they are going away. And they're going away this decade for certain.
Hello, and welcome back to the Sinobabble podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about Peter Zeihan. So the clip that you just heard was Peter Zeihan talking on the Joe Rogan podcast. The podcast was in January. I only decided to make an episode about this in March, and then it's just taken me a while to get it together. Basically, today I want to talk about the things that Peter Zeihan has said in that podcast and just in general about China. So for those of you who don't know, Peter Zeihan is an American geopolitical commentator and strategist. He has several degrees in political science and in Asian studies, and he's also the author of 5 books, which are about sort of global politics and also America's place within the global system. So I hadn't actually heard of Peter Zeihan until this podcast episode, the Joe Rogan episode that he was on. I thought overall it was a very interesting episode. He's a very well-spoken person. He's got a very engaging style, and he tends to talk about geopolitics in a kind of story-like manner that's very easy to follow. I personally got many new perspectives and learned a lot of things about countries I didn't really know anything about. And his new book, which is partly what the podcast was about, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, Mapping the Collapse of Globalization, is currently sitting at a 4.6 star rating on Amazon. So clearly it's very good. So a little bit about the book that he's just released. In The End of the World is Just Beginning, Peter Zeihan maps out the next world, a world where countries or regions will have no choice but to make their own goods, grow their own food, secure their own energy, fight their own battles, and do it all with populations that are both shrinking and aging. The list of countries that make it is smaller than you would think, which means everything about our interconnected world, from how we manufacture products, to how we grow food, to how we keep the lights on, to how we shuttle stuff about, to how we pay for it all, is about to change. So I think that's quite a good setup for us, a framework within to discuss Peter Zeihan and his thoughts about the world. You can see that the framing is generally quite negative. It's talking about sort of deglobalization, how countries are going to have to start fending for themselves, and how many countries won't make it. And in his estimation, one of those countries is China. So like I said, I'd never really heard about Zeihan until I saw him on the Rogan podcast, but from what I can tell, he's become quite popular in the last decade or so since publishing his book Accidental Superpower in 2014, and he's become known for sort of predicting the current Russian invasion of Ukraine. A lot of people have said that he predicted this invasion to, the year, the month, the week, or whatever. I tried really hard. I actually read Accidental Superpower, and I couldn't find this quote that people were talking about anywhere. No one's actually given a direct quote source. They've just kind of said, Zeihan predicted this invasion. So this is what I did actually find that he said. In any form, an independent Ukraine is a threat to Russia, but it is only the first threat Russia must address before 2020. At the time of writing, Russians have already used their centuries-old propaganda tactic of protecting minorities to seize the Crimea and spark rebellions in the eastern Ukraine. Russians will begin working on the Caucasus, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. Once those areas are pacified, the Russians will return to Ukraine, rescuing those in the Russified east and south who ask for help. So he does, as you can see, make some statements about how Russia will return to invade Ukraine. However, Zeihan also maintains a blog, and he also has a YouTube channel, and I found this quote from a blog post that he wrote in 2021. Will Putin order an attack? Dunno. There was a demographic and strategic moment a few years ago when the Russians could have conquered Ukraine easily. That moment is gone and will not return. But the strategic argument that a Russia that cannot consolidate its borders is one that dies faster remains. So here he's a bit more ambivalent and hesitant about stating outright Russia's going to attack in the next year or however long it is, and he doesn't mention any of the other former Soviet states or allied nations to Russia again. I wanted to bring out those 2 points just to give a little, I guess, pin that we can come back to about how Zeihan discusses issues, where he can state something forcefully on the one hand and then kind of rein it back in and sort of change his mind when it's a bit convenient for him, notably when the 10-year period that he's talking about is up and he's getting a bit hesitant. But I wouldn't say that I disagree with everything that he wrote in his book, especially he has a single chapter on China in Accidental Superpower. So I did go through it, mainly to check to see if any of his other predictions came true. And there were just some statements that he made that were a bit uncomfortable for me. So, for example, he says things like 7 million people died in the Chinese Civil War between Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, which I'm just unsure as to where he got that number from. It certainly doesn't match with any official statistics, or even Chinese statistics, actually, that I've seen. I did a double check. None of them really go over the 1 or 2 million mark. So he himself, in the version of the book that I have, he does not give any footnotes for that particular section. He has some footnotes, but not that give data, statistics, references, things like that. He says something else. For example, the Yangtze is China's sole navigable river, which even if you don't know anything about China and all you know is how big it is, that's a completely insane statement. At least to me, there are over 1,000, I think it's like 1,500 plus rivers in China. So the idea that the Yangtze is the only one that's navigable by sea vessel is just a wild thing to say. I don't want to seem like I'm just like nitpicking little statements that I disagree with. I'm just trying to provide some context before we get onto the Rogan podcast clips about Zeihan's manner of communication. I don't want to talk about, his delivery or anything like that, because I don't want to talk about him as a person. I don't want to like attack him or anything. I'm talking about the content of the things that he's saying. Again, I don't disagree with everything that he says. It's just that when he does say things, he often says them generally without any context and kind of assuming the knowledge of the reader and kind of synthesizing large amounts of information. There's a point where he talks about how China was conquered by foreign dynasties, the Yuan and Qing dynasties, and that its own native dynasties, the Han and the Tang dynasties, failed to unify China correctly. It doesn't give any dates for any of these dynasties, so I guess you're just supposed to know that if you don't know anything about China. Doesn't even bother to lay out who the Yuan were, who the Han were, the order of those events as well. The Han and Tang dynasties obviously came before the Yuan and Qing dynasties, and the Qing dynasty was the last dynasty. Yeah, there's just... For me, it's the manner of communication that's more of an issue. It's sweeping and it's general, and I don't like it because I like to be more academic about things, as you know. But like I said, he says some things that I do agree with. So, for example, he says, simply abolishing one child is only one step of the process. China would then need to encourage the young workers who are crammed into apartment housing to produce multiple children while still working and taking care of their parents. It would have to build out an entirely new series of social services in health and childcare, whose absence provided the spare capital that helped make China's manufacturing boom possible. So there's no details here, and that's all he has to say about that. But I actually agree with what he says. Like, I think that that statement is correct. However, if we move on to another statement that he makes, roughly 10% of China's GDP depends upon direct exports to the United States. Another 5% of GDP is locked up in supply chains whose ultimate destination is the American market. Should American trade access be revoked, it would be as if China suffered from an equivalent of 3 American Great Recessions all at once. What a crazy thing to say. This is not correct, in my opinion. Or factually, I suppose. So China and the US are actually supposedly in the middle of a trade war as we speak, and have been so for the past 5+ years, like 5 to 8 years, I guess. Yet trade with the US is only increasing. I actually recently wrote about this in my newsletter. Trade with the US now makes up around 80% of Chinese exports. It's, the US is China's largest export market, and even where there have been bans on certain goods, China can navigate around these using, say, proxies like Vietnam, so like setting up a joint venture in a Vietnamese company and then using that company to export their goods to the US indirectly. I spoke about this in the podcast episode about the Belt and Road, so you can go and listen to that if you want more details than that. Also, he unfortunately wrote this line in his book: for the Chinese, the Americans will be the least of their worries. Ultimately, the Americans will not be worried about China because it is a non-naval power and really not a significant threat to American power in a post-free trade world. So it's been about 10 years since he wrote that book. Those are the things that I thought were worth picking out about China. But let's move into the modern day. Maybe his predictions or the things that he says about China are a bit more accurate now.
Mao was concerned that as the country was modernizing, the birth rate wasn't dropping fast enough and that the young generation was literally going to eat the country alive. So they went through a breakneck urbanization program which destroyed the birth rate. At the same time, they penalized anyone who wanted to have kids. And both of those at the same time have generated the demographic collapse we're in now.
Again, the way that he presents this information makes it seem as if Mao Zedong was responsible for instituting the one-child policy. But that is wrong. The one-child policy was introduced in China in 1980. Mao Zedong died in 1976. So that's a really basic thing that I don't think he gets it wrong. I think saying that he gets it wrong is the wrong way to say it. I think he's just tying lots of stuff in together. And again, not giving that background, not giving that context to explain where the one-child policy even came from, why it was introduced, what Mao Zedong's thoughts about having children really were. It didn't just happen, and it didn't just cause this huge demographic collapse. Again, there is nuance that is missing here. So this isn't to say that Mao didn't want any kind of family planning at all, but it was quite complex, his views on having children. So for example, he said this in 1949. It's a very good thing that China has a big population. Even if China's population multiplies many times, she's fully capable of finding a solution. The solution is production. The absurd argument of Western bourgeois economists like Malthus that increases in food cannot keep up with increases in population was not only thoroughly refuted in theory, but has been completely exploded by the realities in the Soviet Union and the liberated areas of China after their revolution. He then says this in 1958, just before the Great Leap Famine. We are not afraid of a population of 800 million or 1 billion. American reporters say that after 100 years, the Chinese population will constitute 50% of the world population. By that time, our cultural level will be high. When all the people are college educated, they will naturally practice birth control. If anything, that's Mao Zedong seeing into the future there. He really saw that trend coming. So here we see that Mao, in theory, is quite lax about childbirth and family planning. However, he did see some policies that were aimed at reducing the number of births per person. In 1971, China's State Council approved a report on birth control, setting the goals of reducing the annual rate of population growth from 2.5% in 1970 to 1% in cities and 1.5% in rural areas by 1975 as part of the fourth five-year plan. There were lots of other changes made as well, for example, to marrying age, which was increased for both men and women to around 23 and 25. And there was also a campaign launched called the Later, Longer, Fewer, particularly in rural areas, which encouraged people to marry later, leave a longer gap between giving birth, and have children later on. The one-child policy itself did not lead to population collapse. And the main reason that was, and it's very well documented, is that what it actually led to was an increase in unregistered births. So you have a lot of people who were born in the 80s and 90s who are not registered with the system for whatever reason, and that causes problem in their own lives. He also misses the fact that lots of people were exempted from the policy, for example, ethnic minority groups. Rural families were often allowed to have 2 children in underpopulated areas. You could also have a second child, but you would have to pay a fine, or you wouldn't get certain benefits if you had more than one child. But often some people made that choice in order to have more than one child. Especially if you're an agrarian family and you've got land to work, it's not really practical for you to have just one child. He also skips over very well documented and discussed phenomenon like local officials collaborating with people in order to help them circumvent the one-child policy. There's lots of stories about when the planning officials would come to the town, the village heads would sort of gather up all the unregistered children and hide them until the planning authorities had then left again. You know, so there's so much context and nuance here that's kind of just like swept away by this like very generalistic statement that it just makes me feel uncomfortable. And because of the way he states it, I feel like we're kind of skipping over the actual important question. So as you know, China is not the only country in the world to be facing this demographic collapse. It's a problem in most post-industrial advanced countries like the UK, the US. In Asia, you've got South Korea and Japan. It's particularly acute in Europe, in Italy, Greece, Malta, the Netherlands, and even in South America, like countries like Puerto Rico are facing this demographic crisis. It's not just because in China, this paranoid, egotistic megalomaniac decided to suddenly slash birth rates because that's what he wanted. This is a global phenomenon. And the question that I think would actually be a better question to ask or to state would be, is low birth rate actually a predictor of imminent economic collapse? Or imminent political collapse or imminent collapse in general of a state or society? And that's a question that I think Zeihan doesn't even bother to ask. And I think if we did ask that question, then we'd come up with a different answer than China is just going to disappear in 10 years' time. We actually have an example that we can look at. We can look at Japan. So let's talk about Japan, actually. For those of you who are listening, I'm using data sets. So if you want to see the data sets, you can head on over to YouTube to watch the video where I will visualize everything. But I will try and describe what I'm talking about as best as I can. So Japan's birth rate starts falling in 1973 when Japanese Gen X is born. They are the largest cohort, so the population triangle looks like an actual triangle, like a pyramid, like a healthy demography would look like. However, as that part of the population goes up and it moves up towards the middle and up towards the top, the bottom part of their demographic triangle pyramid does not grow. So you get like a skinny bottom and a skinny top and a fat middle. And now the average age in Japan is around 48 or 49. And so you can see in their demographic chart that it's fat in the middle for Japan, skinny on the bottom, skinny on the top. They don't have a lot of people who are young, basically. So let's discuss the decline in Japan's birth rate. It starts falling precipitously in 1973, falling from 2.14 to 1.5 births per woman by 1992. So people go from having 2 kids to like 1.5 kids, which is quite a lot. By 1991, it had declined even further to 1.53. The government then predicted that Japan's population size would start falling around the year 2005 and decline to about half over the course of 100 years. Increased celibacy, childlessness within marriage, and higher incidence of one-child families help explain the post-war decline in Japanese fertility, especially since 1973. Delayed marriage also contributed to the trend in declining fertility. If we look at Japan today, their fertility birth rate is now sitting at 1.3. The average age of a Japanese person, as I said, is around 48 or 49, and their life expectancy is sitting at a healthy 84 years old, which is one of the highest in the world. By way of comparison, China's birth rate is around 1.2, which is lower than Japan's. However, their birth rate didn't drop to under 2 births per woman until 1991, whereas Japan's had already dropped to under 2 births per woman by 1975, so at least 2 decades longer. So let's do some comparisons between China and Japan, as Japan has had this low birth rate for more than a decade now. And let's see if China is on the same track as Japan and what kind of track is Japan actually on. Today, China not only has a lower percentage of people aged 65 and over than Japan had a decade ago, but it also has a larger percentage of the population under 15 than Japan had a decade ago, which means that it's going to reach the point of Japan's demographic collapse slower than Japan did over the course of 10 years, if that makes sense. So I'm using this period of 10 years because that's what Zeihan uses. He says that that's how long China has left, basically. So we know that China is kind of on the same track as Japan in terms of demographic collapse, but its demography is collapsing slower than Japan's did. Bearing in mind Japan's demographic collapse, has Japan collapsed as an economy? No, quite the opposite. Japan is obviously thriving as an economy. They did go through a bit of a rough patch in the 90s and the noughties, stagnation, etc. However, since 1992, Japan's GDP has hovered at around 4 or 5%, peaking at 6% in 2012. What has changed is that Japan's global share of GDP has fallen. It's still one of the top 5 economies in the world. It's one of the most technologically advanced economies in the world, and it's consistently at the top of the rankings when it comes to innovation. Japan is one of those rare countries that actually has a trade surplus. The Tokyo Stock Exchange is the 3rd largest stock exchange in the world by market cap. Japan is just this prime example of how you can adapt as a nation, as a society, when faced with such a large issue as demographic decline. The population is obviously still falling, so it remains to be seen if they can continue to adapt in this situation. But it's just interesting that Zeihan picks on China as, in this case, the demographic collapse is negative, when there are cases, not only generally where you can see that it's not necessarily the case, but he also makes the argument that demographic collapse can sometimes be good. So, for example, in his book, Accidental Superpower, he has this to say about Canada. As Canada ages, its currency strengthens. Mature workers, to say nothing of retirees, consume less. However, mature workers tend to be more productive than young workers. Lower consumption plus higher output results in higher exports. A sustained period of higher exports and lower consumption puts continual upward pressure on the Canadian currency. Also, just to mention that he does talk about China's demographic collapse in Accidental Superpower, so from a 2014 perspective. However, again, not everything that he says comes true. The Chinese will pass the Americans in average age in 2019, and by 2030 will be 42.9 years old versus 39.6 for Americans. So currently, China's average age is 38.4. The average age of an American is 38.5, so he was wrong about that. Also, the percentage of the population under 16 is 23% in China and 24% in the US. So again, if we're comparing like-for-like stats, China is not doing worse than even the US. And if we look at a country like Japan, demographic decline does not necessarily lead to economic collapse. So we can move on from that point.
Without young people, we've seen their labor costs increase by a factor of 14 since the year 2000. So Mexican labor is now 1/3 the cost of Chinese labor. Their educational system focuses on memorization over skills. So despite $1 trillion of investment and a bottomless supply of intellectual property theft, they really haven't advanced technologically in the last 15 years.
So I really want to give Zeihan the benefit of the doubt when listening to his podcast, because he's in an interview. He's got to be brief-ish. Rogan interviews can go on for like 3 hours, 2 or 3 hours, but you know, he's talking about lots of different things. He's got to synthesize a lot of different information, so he might not have time to go into the nitty-gritty. However, saying that China has not technologically advanced at all in the past 15 years is just so ridiculous that I actually don't want to talk about it, but I'm going to do it anyway. So let's start with this statement from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is an international affairs think tank based in the US. They say, today, China directly competes with the US on key emerging technologies such as AI and quantum computing. It has managed to accomplish this feat even as its government has tightened controls on markets, speech, and politics. The benefits of having an authoritarian state are not lost on the CCP. They can essentially identify an emerging sector and then just invest as much like human capital and physical resources as they need to into that project. So it means that anything that they do start doing, they progress very, very quickly in it, even if they haven't innovated it themselves. So China is often accused of stealing other countries' technology, but I would argue that in fact what they're able to do is adopt and adapt. It doesn't really matter who came up with it, it matters how you use it, so to speak. As a result of this methodology, China's technology is so important to the US that it's actually one of the main things that they're worried about, and they talk about it all the time. So, for example, the Wall Street Journal came out with a piece recently about how Congress is investigating cargo cranes in US ports, of all things. So let's see why. They write that it's extremely worrisome that around 80% of American port cranes use Chinese software that is manufactured by a Chinese company, says House Committee on Homeland Security Chairman Mark Green. On behalf of the American people, this committee is demanding answers on the risks these cranes pose to US cybersecurity and the resilience of our critical infrastructure, which is a core aspect of the Homeland Security mission. I mean, just recently, I think last month or so, the CEO of TikTok was hauled in front of Congress to talk about, you know, its links with China and like information warfare and all of these sorts of things. So it's not just that China is a worry for the US. It's one of their main worries, I would argue, at the moment. Zeihan argues that they're not innovative enough because they, you know, the kids learn everything by rote in school, which is just such a demeaning thing to say. It's like saying that everyone in the US is an idiot because per capita the US invests the most in education, but you know, they constantly rank middle for like English, maths and science. So therefore, the US is incompetent and no one can read there, which is just, it's not the case. Even if you want to call them outliers, but generally speaking, that's not how it works. That's exactly the reason why Apple isn't competing with Nokia. They're competing with like Huawei and Oppo, especially in the Chinese domestic market. He makes other arguments that the Chinese domestic market isn't strong enough to support China. Huawei is the largest mobile phone and like technology seller in the Chinese market, but we won't get into all of that. The idea that China is stealing technology aside, it's actually just incorrect to say that China isn't innovating anything, that they haven't come up with any of this technology themselves, especially when it comes to AI and surveillance technology. So a 2019 report by the Financial Times states that, quote, Chinese companies have made every submission to the UN for international standards on surveillance technology in the past 3 years. China's efforts to pioneer standards is a reflection of how its companies are seeking to supply surveillance technology across the world. The Chinese surveillance industry is getting to be one of the most sophisticated in the world, so there is profit to be gained off the back of that. These companies have global ambitions. They don't want to just operate inside of China's closed ecosystem. China's coming up with AI technology that can tell who somebody is just by how they're walking. And that's something that they're coming up with internally, even if they didn't come up with the concept of AI or surveillance themselves. Again, if we want to talk about individuals innovating in a sector, let's talk about something that's become a huge hot topic these days, ChatGPT. Just as Chicago's Second City served as a comedic talent factory for decades, Microsoft's Research Asia, MSRA, Research and Development Center, set up in Beijing in 1998, arguably has been the AI talent factory, producing the top engineers and scientists who ended up in China's AI ecosystem. What's germane to the latest advances in generative AI is MSRA's pioneering research in neuro-linguistic programming. Jianfang Gao, the center's NLP lead from 2000 to 2005, is now serving as the head of Microsoft's deep learning group, embodies that leadership. Gao's work on neural networks and large language models is cited in OpenAI's latest GPT-4 model technical report. While Gao made indirect but valuable contributions to what turned into a commercial product, a slew of Chinese talent directly made it possible. It goes without saying that OpenAI's achievement in generative AI was the result of hundreds of exceptional contributors, but Chinese talent made up nearly 1/5 of GPT-4's core contributors. Of the 32 total Chinese contributors to GPT-4, 11 completed undergraduate studies in China and 21 in the US. When it came to graduate studies, nearly 80% of the Chinese contributors completed their degree in the US and ended up staying. That cohort of Chinese talent may have even contributed to ChatGPT's relative advantage over Baidu's Ernie in Chinese language capabilities. So I pulled out that last little bit about where the Chinese talent studied. Not to go back on the idea that the Chinese education system is fine, because obviously it has its flaws, and all of these people would have attended primary and secondary school in China, even if they went to graduate and undergraduate school in the US. But the reason I actually wanted to talk about it is to point out something that Zeihan skips over, which is that a lot of the time, a lot of advances, especially industrial or technological fields, especially scientific academic fields, are the results of collaborative work. It's not one country competing against another. That's how political regimes like to cast the arena, if you will. It's like two sides pitted against each other. But actually, most of the time, if you read journal articles, whether they be scientific or based in the social sciences or the humanities or whatever, you'll see people from all around the world coming together who are interested in a specific topic, coming together to push that field forward. An argument that I would make is that there is a lot more interdependence at play than Zeihan would let on, and that a lot of American commentators will let on. It's often, China versus the US, and rarely do people stop to think about how the two might be better off working together.
Mexican labor is probably about twice as skilled as Chinese labor now.
So I don't actually know, again, where Zeihan is getting this information on. Like I said, I haven't read his most recent book, so he may well have more data there. But I did some digging myself because I wanted to basically verify whether or not this was true. And it turns out that the UN releases a global competitiveness report, which looks at 141 countries and ranks them by things like GDP, how skilled the population is, things like that. So in their 2019 rankings, China is ranked 28th and Mexico is ranked 48th. This is what the report has to say about each country. China's performance is almost on par with OECD standards. China outperforms 25 OECD countries on the IT adoption pillar. China has been rapidly increasing its innovation capability and is ranked 24th. The country's innovation ecosystem would benefit from a more efficient, more open and fairer domestic market that would allow for more intense competition and better allocation of resources. At the same time, educational institutions as well as businesses are struggling to keep up with evolving skills needed for the economy and is ranked 64th. Given the disruptions brought about by the pace of technological diffusion in China and the growing knack for innovation, the lack of adaptability of human capital could hurt China's development and eventually hurt social cohesion. So the report does highlight there is some problem with skills in China, but the problem lies in the fact that technology is moving fast and skills are failing to keep up. This is something that we see in Western developed nations as well. Here's what the report has to say about Mexico. Mexico is 48th. it drops 2 places due to other countries improving at a faster rate. On the one hand, it's achieved some progress on all 4 of its lowest ranked pillars: institutions, labour, skills, and IT adoption, in which it's ranked 74th. On the other hand, these improvements have been, to some extent, insufficient to fill the gap with other more competitive economies. In terms of skills, educational attainment is still low, and curricula are not up to date. Its digital skills are ranked 99th, and its critical thinking 103rd. Inflation has increased, healthy life expectancy has fallen, and lack of improvements and transport infrastructure require further efforts to advance Mexico's competitiveness closer to the frontier and to that of top-ranked economies. I disagree with Zeihan's statement that China's skilled labour is not as skilled as Mexico's, or Mexico's is twice as skilled, or whatever he said, and those are my reasons why. Feel free to debunk them if you want to. Now I want to talk about some bits and bobs of things that he says. So here's another clip.
They've consolidated into an ethnic-based, paranoid, nationalistic cult of personality, and it's very difficult for the Xi administration to even run it because it's not an administration anymore. No one wants to bring Xi information on anything. So, like, Putin lied to his face, for example, but last February about the war, saying, why would I invade Ukraine? And you can see in some of the presses, the defense guys in the back of the room, like, they didn't want to say anything because Xi has a history of shooting people he doesn't like.
See, this is one of those statements that I have a problem with, not necessarily because it's untrue, but because it's not even based in truth in the first place, if that makes sense. It wouldn't have been a huge problem for Zeihan to produce a couple of examples about where Xi Jinping has gotten rid of his enemies in order to create this sort of cult of personality. He could have talked about the corruption campaign that's going on in China at the moment. He could have talked about the execution of Bo Xilai. Sorry, not the execution, the deposing and sort of getting rid of Bo Xilai. He makes points that are just so vague that you can't even argue with them, which is really annoying because that's what I want to do. But instead, he's doing something that you really don't want to do when it comes to China, which is kind of turning it into this like 1984-esque boogeyman where people are just like hauled off the streets by the secret police at a moment's notice just because they pissed off Xi Jinping. And it's just not the case on the ground. If you read actual literature about how the Chinese state works, you'll know that it's like a slow-moving behemoth that is reliant very much on like these grassroots, ordinary people in order to keep it going. It's not this like overly sophisticated tech state. And weirdly enough, that's Zeihan's argument as well. He's like, it's not a sophisticated country, but on the other hand, it's like this awful place where everyone's under surveillance all the time. And it's like, I just can't put those two ideas together. I recently did a book review of a book called The Logic of Governance in China over on my Substack, so you can go ahead and read that if you want to. The author talks a lot about how it's this cooperation between the center and the periphery, between low-ranking officials and the high-ranking officials, that allows China to keep moving along. And he points out that often in the process of political campaigns, both the choice of targets and the penalties imposed are selected arbitrarily with the aim of deterring others rather than seeking to resolve so-called bureaucratic problems. So nothing is that straightforward, and Zeihan makes it seem like it's really straightforward and this is the easiest way to understand China, but there are just so many nuances that it's just... I'm starting to get exhausted with my own podcast, but we will continue to the end. Regardless,
they're completely dependent on the U.S. Navy to access international trade. They are the most vulnerable country in the world right now.
Please just listen to my podcast on the Belt and Road or read this Substack that I wrote a couple of weeks ago in order to just debunk that whole thing.
Even if the Chinese were able to capture Taiwan without firing a shot, it doesn't solve anything for them. They're still food importers. They're still dependent upon the United States. They're still energy importers. And even if they take every single one of those semiconductor fab facilities intact, they don't know how to operate them because they can't operate their own. And their own are among the worst in the world, not the best.
The Semiconductor Industry Association 2021 report states that, quote, 35% of all semiconductors in the world were made in China in 2019, most of which are not ultimately consumed as products bought by Chinese end users, and instead are reshipped overseas as components of made-in-China devices exported to other countries. I'm skipping over big parts of the podcast, because some bits, like I said, it's unprovable. He makes very vague statements. Xi Jinping isn't having any conversations with anyone anymore, and we know this because the US has like bugged his office. And it's like, if that were the case, then why was there such a big to-do over the spy balloon incidents if the US is listening to everything that's happening in China? It's things like that where it's just like, he's so vague and so sweeping and so generalistic that it's hard to even bring his comments down, because it's like, what can I even take away from that? But again, I go back to the fact that the way he delivers the information is just so smooth and fast-paced as well. Like, you can barely keep up with it. By the time he's made one statement, he's already moved on to the next one. And then that's the reason why China's going to collapse, and they have no hope, and they're completely dependent, and they're the most vulnerable country in the world. It's like, Christ. It's not even as if everything that he says is completely groundbreaking. People harp on about how he predicted that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. But I remember back in 2014, because I'm old and I was there, when Russia invaded Crimea, people at that time were also predicting a larger invasion of Ukraine by Russia. They were saying, Ukraine has the largest Russian-speaking population outside of Russia. Russia has imperialistic aims. It's still salty about the end of empire and the end of the Soviet Union, and it will do what it can to try and get those people back. People were already saying these things. It's not like Zeihan is completely predicting the future on these points. And a lot of the time, the way that he says things is meant deliberately to draw in the audience, right? So he's making sweeping statements and like grand, China will collapse, it's the end of the world, so that people pay attention, because often geopolitics isn't high on people's interest list. And I do understand that. I sympathize with that as somebody who is trying to sort of disseminate information. But I personally think that he is going about it the wrong way. I don't know if it's the content of his message or the delivery, the communication style, the amount of information that he includes. I don't know how much knowledge he actually has about China, and it's impossible for me to tell just by listening to him on these podcasts or reading his books that are meant for a general audience and that are not meant for an academic audience. It's just completely impossible for me to know what exactly he's trying to communicate. I was listening to a completely different podcast the other day that's also about sort of news, politics, contemporary life. And one of the hosts said that we as a society are so obsessed with consuming information about the future and trying to predict what's going to happen next that we often miss the minutiae, the details in the moment that might have more significant consequences than we might think. As a historian, I think I'm quite acutely aware of how really small factors that people didn't see coming end up having huge ramifications on the course of history. No one would have predicted in 1921 that the Chinese Communist Party in 30 years' time would be running the entire country, but that's what happened, and it happened due to a minutia of small events and like lucky breaks, basically. Zeihan was around in the early 1940s or the 1930s. He might have predicted that Chiang Kai-shek would have completely destroyed the CCP in the encirclement campaigns, but that's not what happened. Or that the Communist Party would have been wiped out during the Long March. I'm sure that's what a lot of people thought would happen, but it isn't what happened. I think as someone who looks back a lot, it's always very interesting to me when people try and look forward and try and be that person, that next Fukuyama who can just predict the future at a drop of a hat. I feel like often we are so focused on the future that we do miss the important things that are happening right now. And the interesting things that are happening right now, I think that that's what Peter Zeihan is doing. And potentially that's the thing that I have the most issue with. It's not actually the content of his communication or how he communicates. It's the fact that he's so intent on looking forward that he misses the here and now. But that's it for this episode, guys. Thank you so much for listening. I'm never doing one of these again. I really didn't enjoy that. I don't like tearing down other people or their life's work or their arguments or things like that. So unless this gets a really good response, I don't think I'll be trying to debunk anyone ever again. And I'm not saying don't listen to Zeihan or read his stuff. I think it's really interesting. Like I said, I learned a lot from the Rogan podcast, and I suggest you all go and listen to it and make up your own minds about what he says and how he says it. So don't forget that Sinobabble has a Substack, which you can subscribe to, where I release newsletters about breaking news and try and give some historical context to them. I also have a Buy Me a Coffee where you can support my work. I'm going to do a shout out this week to Mitchell Spindle, who bought me a coffee a couple